let's talk about steak.
So I don't actually cook steak that often, but when I do, this is how I do it. Okay, on a serious note, I'm gonna start out with 2 Wagyu rump steaks. I would suggest trying to get a steak that's at least about 1 inch thick. I'm gonna rub on a very thin layer of oil onto both sides of the beef. I know that Wagyu does have a lot of intermuscular fat, but as the steak goes into a hot pan, I just find that it helps it sear a bit more evenly. Now, we're going to cook the beef in a few stages. The first stage is a very hot sear where the goal is to sort of give the beef a nice crust as quickly as possible without cooking the interior. You'll notice that I'm swirling the beef around in the pan, which might go against everything that you've been taught in school. The fact remains that when you're heating up a pan, the pan stores a lot of thermal energy or heat throughout. So by swirling the beef around the pan, you're allowing it to pick up all that thermal energy, and since the goal is to sear the beef as quickly as possible, you want to use as much heat as the pan can give. Also take the effort to stand the beef up on its side so that all those edges can be seared as well. As I've mentioned before, the goal here is not to actually cook the beef, but to just develop a sear or char on the outside. So once you've developed the right amount of color, immediately pull it from the pan and let it sit and rest on a wire rack. You'll start to see the surface of the meat sort of start to sweat, and that's really the juices that have been pushed out because of the heat as well as the rendered fat from the beef. Don't worry about that because that is completely normal, and we are going to use it as a glue because we're going to season the beef with salt and black pepper. The next ingredient is what I think really makes this steak so special, and that is mushroom powder. Mushroom powder is essentially dried mushrooms that have been ground into a very fine powder. You can technically make this yourself by dehydrating your own mushrooms and then grinding it in a spice grinder, or you can simply just buy it in grocery stores online. The point of the mushroom powder is not to give the steak a mushroom flavor, but to sort of give the steak much more umami. In my experience, most guests will not be able to tell that there is any kind of mushroom on the steak, because the point of the mushroom powder is really just to give the steak much more umami and depth of flavor. But it's not like you're getting 2 separated, distinct flavors. It's more like you're getting much more beefiness from the steak. Once the mushroom goes on, you can see that it looks really dry, but after letting it sit for about 5 minutes, you start to see it get really moist, and that's from the juices and oils that were on the surface of the steak. At this stage, I'm using an optional step, which is to chuck the beef into the fridge overnight. I will explain why I do this later, but when you're ready to cook the beef, you want to heat up a bit of butter in a pan that's on medium to medium-high heat. Do not use the same super high heat as the initial sear because the mushroom powder and the black pepper can burn under extreme heat. You just want to sear it on both sides to kind of set that mushroom crust, and you also want to take note not to move the steak around too much because the mushroom crust can break off, and we want to avoid that. Once the crust has developed, you want to transfer it onto a wire rack, and just like the first sear, the steak is still essentially raw in the center. And that is why I am placing it into the oven to let it come up to temperature. I like to use a relatively lower oven temperature of anywhere between 80 to 100 degrees, and this will of course stretch out the cooking time, but it will also allow the beef to cook much more evenly. This can take anywhere between 30 to 60 minutes depending on what temperature you use and how thick your beef is. The best way to tell when it's done, of course, as I've mentioned in other videos, is to use a temperature probe, but because of the lower temperature, you don't need to keep checking it every 1 to 2 minutes. After you hit the 30-minute mark, you can more or less just probe the beef every 4 to 5 minutes. Just check the internal temperature and pull it when it's cooked to your desired doneness. I usually aim for in between medium rare and medium when I'm cooking with Wagyu because I think that Wagyu can take a little bit of a higher heat, which helps to render out a bit more fat. So part of the reason why I break the cooking process up into a few stages is because when I run cooking events, I'm usually the only one cooking, which means that anything I can do that helps me reduce my workload on the actual day I have to serve really benefits me. So the fact that one day before the event, I can actually do the pre-sear, the seasoning, and let the beef dry out really reduces the amount of time I have to spend working on the beef the next day. There are also benefits to letting the beef sit overnight in the fridge. It lets the salt penetrate through to the core of the meat much better, which gives you a much more evenly seasoned steak. And second of all, the same theory also applies to the mushroom crust. I find that it sort of blends into the steak a bit better and you don't get such a distinct mushroom flavor. Like I said, the point is not to taste mushroom and steak, you just want to taste a steak that has much more umami. And letting it sit in the fridge overnight allows you to do that. Third of all, letting the mushroom crust dry out overnight in the fridge will allow it to sear up much better when you have to serve it.
What I really love about this is just how tasty the steak is on its own. You don't even need to eat it with any sauce. Okay, I know using Wagyu is a bit of a cheat code because even if you cook Wagyu to like well done, it will still be pretty tender. But the main point of this recipe is about the technique and the flavor. You can use whatever kind of steak you want. As I mentioned before, you don't actually have to rest the steak overnight in the fridge, but my recommendation is that you do because it really does help season the steak much more evenly. All it really takes is a bit of time management and time planning. Yeah, this currently is my favorite method of cooking steak. There are 1,000 ways that you could cook steak, but this just so happens to be mine. I really like this method because it just fits into my workflow a bit better, especially when I'm executing events alone. It's not the kind of recipe that you really need to watch over very carefully, and that frees me up to do other mise en place, which is necessary for me because I work alone. So there you have it. This is my current method of cooking steak. I hope you learned something new, and I hope you give this method a try. Let me know if it works for you, and I will see you on the next video.